Hey, welcome everyone to the Project Crest webinar. I am Jamie Halzer. I'm an associate professor in the counseling program at Pitt, and I'm thrilled to introduce this evening's webinar speaker. We have Hunter McGowan with us, who will be giving a talk titled Transition: A Consumer's Perspective. Hunter is currently working on his master's degree in counseling from PennWest Edinboro campus. And, usually I do a longer introduction, but Hunter is here to tell his story. So I'm not going to say too much more. We're looking forward to hearing more about your experiences, Hunter. And so I will turn it over to you.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you. And like Jamie said, I am currently working in my master's in counseling. I'm in my last semester. So I definitely can relate to many of you we're nearing the end. So, I can feel the fatigue as well. But for me, it's exciting because I'll be, graduating, and moving on to the next step. To just quickly kind of wrap up that part, in the counseling program at PennWest Edinboro, I'm definitely more interested in the vocational rehabilitation aspect of my counseling education. I am studying in the area of the dual area of clinical rehab and mental health. I just think, mental health is so integrated in everything. It really, you can't really think about it without, considering mental health in almost everything that we do now. So I think it's just important. But again, that's where my emphasis is in really in the vocational rehab area of that. And I think this is a really interesting project or program that Pitt's doing, trying to, integrate, these two important education, fields, educators and counselors. Working with this population of people with, legal blindness or visual impairment. I think it's so important that we kind of build those relationships and build that collaboration. I think sometimes we, get in that mindset of working in a silo, working in isolation. And, I don't think that's always the best way to best provide services for the student or client. That collaboration is so important. So before I get into my talk a little bit about my perspective, my experience, I just wanted to kind of maybe engage with you guys, maybe ask if I could have two volunteers. So one from an educator, TVI, and the other one from the counseling program, what your thoughts are on transition. So, what are your thoughts about, what transition should look like for a student or consumer?
This is Joanna. What can you clarify? What do you mean? So my son went from a senior in high school to a college freshman, kind of what that transition should have looked like.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, that could be one area of transition, going from a secondary institution to post-secondary. That could be one example.
Well, in his case, it was a little overwhelming. I have to admit that it was overwhelming at times. Mm-hmm. We kind of got into the OVR game a little late. Mm-hmm. And I kind of blame that on the TVIs throughout his high school career, that they didn't make that known to me as a parent that he should be hooked up with OVR. So finally he got hooked up with them, and then COVID hit, and that was a big a mess. But he finally did get enrolled with an OVR case manager. But it was very, very rushed. I mean, he had an assistive technology evaluation, so that was very helpful. He, got a lot of equipment. He got tuition assistance. But I just have to say that if I wasn't there guiding it and pushing it with my TBI knowledge, I would say the average parent would have had a very, very, very difficult time managing that transition for him, especially it being an out-of-state school. That really threw a big barrier up, because Virginia Tech really didn't know how to handle somebody from Pennsylvania with tuition assistance and different things.
Yeah. Well, thank you for sharing. It sounds like there was like a little bit of miscommunication, or maybe just not, between the TBI and you and your son. There wasn't a lot of, there might have been some miscommunication there in terms of not telling you or informing you of what your options could be in that transition process.
Correct. Yeah.
How about from like a counselor, from a counselor perspective, like some of the counselors here on the call, what, like thinking about that transition, what, hearing that story, what do you think as a VR counselor could have been done differently?
I can take this for the counselors. Transitioning from, like, at least my experience, from a mental health standpoint, there's a lot of adjustment. So having that adjustment period sort of taken into consideration in terms of anxiety, in terms of acclimating to a new place, getting assistive technology probably would be part of that as well. There's just a lot of different moving parts that have to occur during that transition that I think goes under the wayside a lot of times. Transportation, huge one. Access, to resources is another huge one. So yeah.
Yeah, you bring up a really good point, looking at the flip side of mental health, individuals with mental health, serious mental health issues there, in their rehabilitation and their transition, considering different things that you talked about. One thing that I have learned, and I did try to come at a mental health site, and we are looking, at that from my perspective as a rehabilitation counselor. I always thought that adherence to medication was such an important aspect to their rehabilitation, to be, into their transition, making sure that that was integrated in their recovery to be able to, enter or re-enter employment. I thought was something that I never thought about before that experience for me. So, yeah, well, thank you. I appreciate some of the comments. Just looking through. I think some core themes in transition that I feel, from my experience and my perspective, is identifying goals, helping the person set goals, and then from my counseling perspective, we think about, the SMART goal, working with a client or a consumer, how specific, how measurable, how achievable, is it relevant, is it time-oriented to the person, when thinking about a goal. other areas that I think are important to involve that we touched upon in our little discussion there is the role of self-determination, the self-advocacy part for the consumer or the student, and helping that person develop those skills are so very important, and knowing the person's rights as a person with a disability. And so I like to, as a counselor, when I work with people, when I work with consumers, I like to get to know the person, not just their disability, not just, the functional limitations that they might be, struggling with, maybe the employment barrier. I like to know the person as a whole person. I like to know a little bit about their family. I like to know just a little bit about their interests, what they do in their spare time, maybe besides school or work. So I like to give a little bit of insight into my background. So I am the youngest of, two older siblings. I have one sister and one brother, and I have parents, mom and dad. So that's kind of a little bit about background about my family structure. And so I am the only individual in my family that has a vision impairment and a hearing impairment. So, I was the only person in my family that had experienced those issues. So I think that's important too, growing up when you're working with a person that has, a visual impairment, is really considering the family, the family system, and how that may affect the person's adjustments or adaptation to their disability. How the family might be a facilitator or a barrier to certain aspects of the person's development. Because I always like to think about things, as I am becoming, entering into the field of counseling. I like to think of things that like, what are facilitators in the environment, and then what are barriers in the environment that might be, impacting the individual's level of functioning. So we already know I'm working on my master's in counseling, and I have received a bachelor's degree in social work from Edinboro University in 2019. So I have that degree. And then I decided from that point, I wanted to go into a master's in counseling rather than, pursuing a degree in social work, because I know what I wanted to do specifically is I wanted to work in vocational rehabilitation. And that field is a very specific and specialized area. So that was kind of one of the big motivators for me, and that I am a consumer of, the services that we are talking about, the services and programs that I received, from my TBI and from my VR counselor. So, and again, I have a combined vision and hearing loss. So I identify as being deaf-blind. My diagnosis is Zellweger spectrum disorder. It was previously clinically diagnosed as Usher syndrome type 2. But again, I said previously diagnosed when I was very young. So the Zellweger is characterized by an eye condition called retinitis pigmentosa, which affects the retina of the eye. And so I was affected as a child. the RP manifested itself when I was between the ages of 3 to 4. And so then the hearing loss, I have a bilateral sensory neural severe to moderate hearing loss. So that means the hearing loss is the same in both ears. And it means that my cochlea is affected. The inner part of my ear is affected. So my hearing loss is permanent. Knock on wood, when I was diagnosed at a young age, my vision and hearing hasn't changed much over the years. So some slight changes, but nothing drastic. So that's always good news. Stable is always good news. Again, like I said, the diagnosis period, when they first diagnosed me with Usher's, was between the ages of 3 to 4. And because it was so, since I was so late in my age, I missed a lot of that early intervention piece that's so relevant today. I missed that at that time. And so how that all progressed, this diagnosis, that process, I was typical developmentally. I was speaking, I was following the same milestones as my older siblings. And, at a certain point, between 3 to 4, I became more non-responsive to my parents and people in the environment. So that kind of set up red flag, in terms of what could be happening then. And so I had different tests. Finally, I had an audiogram done, and they found that I had a hearing loss. So that made sense, with that piece there. And then how my visual impairment was diagnosed at such a young age, and how that manifested itself was in 2 ways, really. So I think for my parents at the time, I think the most significant factor that kind of tipped something off for them was that I really had trouble with night blindness more than usual, more than a usual toddler might be afraid of the dark. So that was kind of part A of that. And then the other big red flag, that something wasn't quite right there, was that I have nystagmus. So the shaking of my eyes, the one eye does shakes diagonally, and then the other one moves in a circular motion. So that, caused some concern. And the ophthalmologist that I was seeing at that time sent my parents and I to Children's Hospital in Boston to undergo testing there at a young age. And that's where they, discovered that, it wasn't a brain tumor, that it was just, retinitis pigmentosa is what I had. And then there go the diagnosis of Usher syndrome. So that's just a little bit about me. Again, I like to kind of consider the whole person. And so I like to try to give that, in my presentation, in a snapshot. I think when we think about transition, we have to think about what are the key individuals involved in this person, whatever this transition may look like. If it's a secondary to post-secondary transition, or maybe like the one person was saying, mental health transition. So in their recovery, you have to think about what are the key individuals that are involved in that process. So when we're thinking about my transition, my experience, you know, it's the family, the involvement of the family, you know, the educators. So that would include, for me, that would include a TBI and an O&M person, a teacher of the deaf and hard of hearing for my hearing impairment. And that's also involving, you know, an audiologist as well at that same level. And then also a speech and language pathologist. Those were kind of the key individuals when I look back on my experience that were involved in almost all of those transitions, you know, from, you know, in terms of my education and experience. And we can't, you know, forget the most important person, obviously, is me or the student or consumer. You know, and other key individuals that I think back on my experience are the social workers that were involved in the specialized services for children, which is under the Bureau of Blindness and Visual Services, which is under OVR. And they were involved when I was in that early age, before school age. And they were really the only service that I was, the first and only service that I was connected to at a young age. And what's good about this program is they came to the house, they came to the community, into the community, and really kind of got the ball rolling, got things started in this whole journey that, you know, my life, and helping get oriented to different services and different programs and different tools that are out there for my parents, especially, you know, because, you know, I think it's important that we always involve a child in different, their input, their perspective, but it all ultimately comes down to the parent involvement at that specific point in time in childhood, because, you know, just kind of how that goes sometimes. And then the last person that I think in my experience that was so important was the counselor, specifically the VR counselor through the Bureau of Blindness and Visual Services. Now, they didn't come, you know, involved till much later in, you know, the process. I think the first time was I was about the age of 14. So I would probably put it at middle school is when I was first introduced, and then just slowly over time, they become more involved. So. So, like I said, I kind of touched upon some of these ideas, but for me, my experience that I have found that, you know, important factors in my transition process was the involvement of the family and the student in the process, as well as I always think that interdisciplinary and collaboration is important. And for me, in my experience in education and transition, you know, in education and post-education, I think a lot of planning is involved, and that's a big piece of that. And you know, that planning is so important to have. So I'm going to discuss this different major parts of transition in my experience. I'm going to pause. Are there any questions at the moment, or Jamie?
I don't see anything in the chat right now.
Okay. I,
Can I ask a quick question?
sure.
Sorry to interrupt, but how did you get connected with OVR so young?
How do I get the question is how you get connected with OBR, correct?
Yeah, at such a young age. You said
Yeah.
before school age you were already connected with OVR?
Yeah. So how it should work, and sometimes it doesn't always happen, is well, at least in the Bureau of Blindness and Visual Services have this specifically. They have social workers under OBR, because so the Bureau of Blindness and Visual Services serves the specific population of people who are blind or visually impaired and have secondary and possibly secondary disabilities. So they have social workers that can come in when the person's young at early intervention, and then they usually back off, once the child becomes a school aide, because the responsibility shifts to the school district. But that social worker should be, kind of just keeping tabs on that person as they get older. And once they reach that transition age, which in Pennsylvania is 14, then they should refer that individual, to the VR program within the Bureau of Blindness and Visual Services. And then that's where the person would then be able to meet with that counselor to get started in that process.
Okay, thanks.
I hope that answered your question.
Yeah, for sure it did. Thanks.
For, like I said, for BBS, that's how it works for that bureau under OBR.
Can I make a comment, please?
Yes, go ahead.
So my son, the one that's visually impaired, he actually was born and went to grade school in Illinois. He moved to Pennsylvania in 8th grade.
Mhm.
So there was kind of that transition, getting his IEP transferred, getting services set up in Pittsburgh, and so forth. So that was kind of a different, Illinois, of course, works a little differently than Pennsylvania. However, the biggest barrier I found, especially with OVR services or just getting services, is that it seems like in Pennsylvania, the TVI changes, or it could possibly change every year. So as a TVI myself, I mean, I find that just ridiculous, because you're passing off students to another person and they have to relearn that person. So I basically say that's why Zach was kind of missed in the transition to OVR services and didn't get them until too late, because it's just this constant changing of TVIs. And I don't know why the AIU does that. I don't think, the School for the Blind certainly doesn't do that. So they may have a better chance of consistency. But when it comes to the AIU and them having to change TVIs every year and give them a new caseload, I think that's just kind of it really presents a barrier for the students with consistency.
That's interesting. I thank you for pointing that out, and that's something I will go into in the next section. That in my experience, that wasn't really the case. I was fortunate enough to have a very consistent TVI / O&M and teacher, the same person for both jobs, and I had one consistently over my educational experience. So I think I was fortunate in that matter, but I think that's an interesting perspective, because you think about the continuity of services aren't always as smooth, and not it can be a barrier for students to have that changeover, that turnover with different teachers. All right, I will go into then my next point of transition then in my experience. So since I had the hearing impairment, my parents decided to have me attend an approved private school for deaf children in Pittsburgh, known as DePaul School for Hearing and Speech. And DePaul, DePaul School was really focused on, spoken and oral communication for their students. And I attended DePaul for a significant aspect of my early childhood education for 8 years, from kindergarten all the way up to 8th grade. And the reason for that was because the reason I left at 8th grade is because DePaul, during my stay there, discontinued their high school program that they had for so long. So students were forced eventually, to transition back into their either their another school or, most likely their homeschool district of origin, wherever that may be for them. So that was the reason why for that transition. But I will say my experience there, my educational experience was very good. My needs were met, was supportive there. My needs for hearing, my hearing impairment were met. So they had teachers who were qualified to teach children who were deaf. They had speech language pathologists that were there, multiple there. So really all of those needs that were, for me, for my hearing loss were met. They had an on-staff audiologist there, and they had very high standards for their education subject that I remember just learning, being in the classroom. And I think a very important benefit and advantage for me in this school was the class size. The class sizes were very small. I can't remember a class being bigger than 8, 10 students at least. And even that was very rare. It was usually like maybe 5 or 6. So there was a lot of group learning happening, but there was also a lot of that the teacher could make sure individual needs were being met within the classroom. And my needs were met. My vision loss needs were met there. So all 8 years they had a TBI and O&M person come to the school and work with me from one of the intermediate unit. And I worked with this person very consistently throughout my whole experience there for the majority of my education there. So I think that had a lot to do with, my need also being met in the classroom, considering my vision loss. I remember they had a CCTV in the classroom for me. They, the teachers worked with the TVI very closely to make sure the material was all prepared in the format that I needed to. Then the O&M person, which was the same as the TVI, taught me how to use my cane. And taught me Braille and assistive technology while I was there, which I think is very important to learn those skills while I was young, so I could develop them and get used to them. Because I remember, and I shouldn't say I remember, but I know, my parents, when I was young, they were being told very different things from professionals about, my eye and ear condition, like what to do, what not to do, those sort of things. And I remember my parents saying that, there were many professionals that would say, oh, he doesn't need to, use a cane yet, or, oh, he doesn't need to know how to do certain things until such and such an age, and that would usually much later in life. When I was a teenager, is what they were saying to my parents, that those skills should be, pushed back until those later years in education. But there were some other professionals that were saying to my parents that no, that's not, really the best for the child, for the student. And thankfully, my parents listened to them and really advocated and pushed for me to kind of learn those skills at a much younger age. I now looking back, I think it was a good idea, and I'm much appreciative of that because I'm so comfortable and I feel good about using them now, especially like a cane or assistive technology. I don't feel any different because I use them. And I think all those years back in DePaul was really the start of that process for me. And so, like I said, the TVI and O&M teacher would come in and we would work very closely together. I would be involved in my subject, and then at a specific time of the day, she would take me out of a certain subject that may not been as important, like a study hall. And then her and I would work together closely on Braille or assistive technology or mobility, cane skills. And where DePaul is located more in the city of Pittsburgh. So there's a lot of things in walking distance, sidewalks and things like that. So I remember how much fun, when I look back, how much just enjoyment or fun that I had going out using my cane because we were able to walk to so many different places. And I had to, learn how to use my cane during those lessons. So I look back on that and I appreciate what was happening now, being able to use my cane in assistive technology so comfortably. But really in this portion of DePaul, this is where I started to use more advanced assistive technology, more high-tech technology, because prior to that, or prior to my lower grades at DePaul, I was still using, large font, large paper, but eventually I was introduced to the first piece of assistive technology, at DePaul, called Kurzweil 3000, and that is an optical character recognition software, and that can basically read almost anything that you upload into it on the computer, so PDF, Word documents, and such. And that was such a, that gave me such an edge in the classroom, when I had to start doing more advanced work, because I think, once I realized that my family, my parents realized that I had to transition back into, my home school district, that I needed all the competitive advantages that I could get from assistive technology or from cane skills, things like that. So really developing that and my advocacy skills. Another big thing that I think from my experience with transition at that point too is something noteworthy that I want to bring attention to is, during my IEP at DePaul, even when I was a young child in the kindergarten, first, second grade, usually you don't involve the child as much in those meetings. But my parents decided to have me involved, slowly over time and incrementally as well. So they wanted me to be brought down to the meeting when they were occurring, and I would maybe sit in for 5 minutes, at a young child at a young age, and just talk about myself for a little bit, kind of what I'm doing now. And then the next grade year, maybe I'll stay down there a little bit longer, until the goal was to involve me to the point where then eventually I would lead my IEP meeting later on in high school. So again, and so another important transition period was going from DePaul to my school district, Norwin High School. And this was a big change, a big adjustment to occur from going from a small approved private school to a big public school in my area. So we did a lot of planning, at least 3 years in advance, really kind of getting all the team together, from DePaul and Norwin, bringing on new people from Norwin to kind of, transfer things from DePaul, knowledge-wise, skill-wise, technology-wise, trying to put all the pieces together to make such a more smooth transition between, the two schools, because, my Norwin high school was such a bigger school. The classrooms were much bigger. I was going from, a classroom of, like I said, 6, maybe 8, a classroom of 25 or 30. So quite a bit different in terms of that. So like involving in that transition, was individuals from Norwin, this new school that I was going to, DePaul, so the staff that I was working with there. We had the involvement of the different IUs, because I was the IU that was in working with DePaul was going to be different from the one that I was going to Norwin. They were in 2 different counties. So even that had to be worked, had to be figured in there, calculated. We had Patton come in, and then we also had, the PA deafblind project as well. So this is like a natural break in my talk. So are there any questions or comments?
There are not any comments in the chat, but definitely open it up if anybody has any questions or comments.
This is Dawn. So
Go ahead.
Sorry. I don't feel like I necessarily learn how all these organizations work together. And as a TBI, I do know in reaching out, transition age, but you're saying like Patton got involved and all these, like, I don't know who all involves all the organizations and how they all work together. So to be able to advise a parent, a student, I feel like I would need to know more.
Yeah. Yeah, there is it is a lot to think about. And for me, that was my experience, because I was both, having the combined vision and hearing loss. There was a lot more people involved to kind of to support my needs as I was transitioning between the 2 different schools. But you are right. I think that can be an issue and a barrier sometimes to the delivery of services when we think about transitioning for this population, involving the right people and forming those relationships. That's very tricky. I think really what can be best learned from this is really as a TBI and a counselor is really building your network, building your connections with different people, different agencies in the community is really important. I think it is a strong suggestion for collaboration to be done. I know that didn't answer the question or the comment, but that's what I would like to see in being done differently. And I think from this program that it is trying to doing between TBI and the clinical rehab and counseling program, I think is a good first start to that.
Okay, thank you.
Was your I just have two actually little questions, and just to go off of what you were just saying, I know that it is a problem that services are siloed, and it's know who's it falls, I suppose, to the parents to be kind of coordinating and learning all of this. I'm just trying to think about like who else would be in that role. Was the VVR, or sorry, your OVR counselor helpful in coordinating? Like, were they a person who kind of knew everything, or did it really fall on like you and your family to learn everything and seek out all the services and put it all together?
I'm sorry, you were breaking up a little bit there.
Sorry. Oh shoot. I was just wondering if there was anybody other than you and your parents who were helpful in coordinating all the services.
Yeah, that's a good question. So again, so because of my combined vision and hearing loss, the Pennsylvania had the Deaf Blind Project, which is under the Bureau of Special Education, and my mom was involved in that from a very early age as a parent. So I think, from her and my dad being a part of that from an early age is where they really got connected to, different professional, different services. And so I think Patton was a big, connector there, connecting different services and programs that was helpful to my parents and myself.
Okay, great. So yeah, your parents were really out there networking and forming those, making those connections.
Yeah, that can be really hard sometimes too with, for the parent, maybe with a child, with a disability or blindness. And I don't know, from my experience, my parents were able to go through the process, of the beginning process, I guess, of, the grief process of, dealing with that on their own, but eventually kind of realized that that wasn't going to get them anywhere, too quick. So, kind of having to step up and, advocate for their child wherever possible. Like I said, for me, I know, I think for my parents' sake, like when they were getting so many messages from professionals, like for example, like, oh, he doesn't need to know how to use the cane till, he's much older, or he has, he's experiencing more vision loss, than he already is, which I think isn't really thinking, first off, thinking best for the student, and I think it's harder to learn the cane when you're older rather than you're younger. So.
And then just one other question I wanted to ask along those same lines. It's cool that your parents were you know, bringing you in, like trying to get things going as early as possible. That seems like it was really helpful. And I love that they were bringing you into the IEP meetings before anybody else was inviting you in. And what was that like from your perspective to be involved in the IEP meetings? Just what was that like, and when did you feel like you were able to start contributing, like right off the bat, or was it, I don't know, I'm just curious about what that experience was like.
I think, I mean, I can't remember when I was in first grade or much beyond that, or in 10th, but I just, you know, I think, you know, as I started getting older and started, I think, using assistive technology more, high-tech assistive technology. Like, for example, once I started learning how to use Kurzweil, I think it's something I really remember, you know, being involved in the IEP planning then, you know, in terms of like how that was working for me, what did I like about it, and things like that. I think that was maybe around 4th or 5th grade, if I am remembering correctly, you know, that I started using that specific OCR software. But I would, yeah, so
Thanks.
I think too, the important part about my experience at DePaul is that they really, not just like my IEP team, but just in general, they were really big on teaching their students, you know, that had hearing impairment, but also, you know, me, deafblind, really were very big on self-advocacy. So really being comfortable with kind of expressing your needs to the teacher or to whoever, you know, if you're having an issue. So I remember that being a big part of that experience.
Great, thank you.
Because, you know, as we talk more, and I talk more about my transition experience and my education experience, you know, that whole idea of bringing me involved in the IEP at a, you know, much younger age than, you know, most traditionally, I had a thought, I lost it, but bringing me involved at that early age, you know, and helping me develop my own advocacy skills, I think really paid off in the end. You know, because when I transitioned into Norwin, my high school, I remember advocacy was such a big part, you know, that my parents were pushing, that my TVIs were pushing, you know, really, you know, being engaged with the Norwin staff, you know, my new TVI, my new teacher of the deaf, and other core team members, but also the just general education classes as well. Really being able to advocate for myself was important. To really talk about, you know, what were the challenges that I had, how have I, you know, what are the solutions to those challenges that I find most successful. And I remember that was important because I, even first right off the bat, when I was going into Norwin, they wanted to put me, they wanted to place me into, you know, special education classes. And, you know, myself and my family didn't think that was an appropriate, you know, match at that point. So we had to kind of advocate otherwise, that wasn't a good fit for me. I needed to think being involved in general education classes was a better fit. Bringing in those instructional staff where needed to support me in those general education class. You know, so I was also in advanced placement classes during high school, not many, but a few. So, you know, that was later on during my experience in high school. You know, I was involved in the Honor Society. I was a varsity swimmer. So I was on the swim team. So I was involved in the high school, as a typical student should be, regardless of deaf, hearing or vision loss. I think that's important too to remember, the person in that experience. So for me, like I said, I talked about kind of the core people. But when I was going to high school, we added another person because of my deaf blindness, because I have 2 sensory impairments, not just one. These are specialized individuals that are called interveners, and they are individuals that work with students who are who have combined vision and hearing loss in the classroom. And that person I work with on the most regular basis every day, from start to the end time, 5 days a week. She was a very important person in helping, the everyday things of it. And then like with meeting with the TBI and O&M teacher and, the teacher of the deaf, I would meet with them individually during like a study hall period, to be taken out of that period and then be work with them on those instructional skills and goals under my IEP. And then another important, I think, important aspect that we really instituted at the high school level, my parents were very involved in this and making this happen, and myself. So we would have the IEP meeting annually, just like you're supposed to, but we went a step further, and this was very helpful. We would have 4 quarterly team meetings, quarterly transition meetings that we would have throughout this academic school year. So those meetings, the 4 quarterly meetings, would be more specific to just the core team of the, it wouldn't be bringing in everybody on the IEP, but it would be bringing in the core people that were focused on that next transition, the post-secondary transition. Because everyone knew at that point, including myself, that college was the next step, and then eventually competitive employment. So, and that was the goal. And this stage, when I would reach, I would say my junior and senior year, and some of my, and I say, and part of my sophomore year is when I started leading the meetings more on a regular basis. So that was where that idea was to have me involved, even at a small role, yonder at DePaul, really now kind of came to fruition, so to speak, to that goal being reached. So, and then the last part of this transition into Norwin, getting ready for the post-secondary transition, my parents and I decided that we would stay under the school district until my age 21, with the goal to still work on some IEP services and goals there. And so what this was going to look like was that I wouldn't step 1 foot in the school building, because all of my coursework, my academic work, was already achieved. I completed that for the graduation portion of the requirement, so I didn't have to do anything related to that. So this staying under Norwin was more specifically just to reach the benefit of still receiving some of those IEP under IDEA, services. Because once a person exits the secondary educational system, everything changes. And I think, from the TBI perspective, I don't know if they always realize how different things are going to be for that person, that student, when they go into the adult system. So, I think my parents were very aware of that change. So I think we just wanted to benefit from as much of the time as we could. And then the goal in this transition year was to be focused on job exploration, and focusing on community-based involvement. So I did do some part-time work at a retirement community under a specific program. So, and then the other time that I would attend a local community college, the other times of the week when I wasn't at the retirement community working. So I would be doing that as well. And the goal there was to start small with the college classes. So the first semester I started with 2 classes. Then the second semester under this transition year, I went up to 3 classes. And then by the time I was done with this transition year, I felt comfortable enough to take on 4 classes on a regular basis. And which is important because that is the standard to receive tuition assistance from BBVS under OVR to be at the minimum of full time. So that was important to kind of work up that stamina and that experience up to that point. Because even then, there's a lot of difference between, high school classes versus college classes for a person with a visual impairment, and for myself, deaf blindness. And so that was important. And I think too, when I think about my journey through transition, my perspective, and going back a little bit too, is every time I, learned a skill, whether that would be technology specifically, specifically talking about assistive technology, is how my parents and the IEP team made it happen. Was I would start with learning one skill, and then once I mastered that, or felt comfortable with that, then I would move to the next skill, and then it usually incorporated doing more. So, for example, learning how to use Kurzweil 3000, learning how to use the functions, the reading functions, how to input text, text boxes to answer questions. That was usually the big thing that I learned about at DePaul. Like all the material that was uploaded to Kurzweil to make it accessible, like all my textbooks and all of that, was done by the TVI at that time. But eventually, when I transitioned into Norwin, and I was working closely with my intervener the first maybe year and a half, she was still inputting a lot of those, documents and materials into Kurzweil, getting them prepared for me for classes. But eventually, I had to learn with her and my TVI how to do those things, how to upload different documents to Kurzweil, how to do things like that, because eventually when an individual that uses such technology that is blind, when they go off to college, if that is what they really want to do, they have to learn how to do all of those things that maybe at one time the TBI have done for them. And then once they get to college, they have to do it themselves. I mean, no one's going to help you, upload material for classes. You have to know how to do that, or know how to ask for help. But be better yet, be prepared to know how to do it so you can do it as independently as possible. So those are just like the progression of my transition experience through DePaul, through Norwin, and then eventually getting prepared to go post-secondary and working with the offices of students with disabilities and VR services. Because, you know, when I was at Norwin, I was still using the technology that Norwin had acquired for me in the classroom. But once I left Norwin, I had to obtain my own assistive technology through my VR counselor. I had to go through that process to make sure I had secured all that technology that I needed to be successful in the classroom in college. And then working with, you know, the offices for students with disabilities, that's such an important part in post-secondary experience for all students with disabilities, but specifically those who may have legal blindness or other secondary disabilities, really knowing how to advocate for yourself to that person so you can obtain the accommodation, the necessary accommodation that you need in the classroom. So for me, that was like getting the material ahead of time from the professor, asking if they would be able to provide me with the material ahead of time so I could make it accessible through the various technology that I was using on my laptop. Was one example of an accommodation or thing that I had to advocate for in the classroom. Other accommodations that I asked for and that I received was testing accommodations, of being able to take the test in a different location with a reader and scribe, someone who would read me the exam and write my answers down or write the choices down. So these are all the little things that one person with a visual impairment and myself with deafblindness had to think about moving to that post-secondary experience. And, you know, what I think is really important to consider is, you know, when we think about IDEA, we think about entitlement to services and programs under the school district. But again, once the student, you know, exits that system and is in the adult system, it becomes the issue of eligibility for services and programs and how to disclose and advocate and document your disability so you can acquire those accommodation services and programs as an adult. And that kind of wraps up that section of my experience. I don't know if there's any questions as we move along.
I had a question.
Yeah.
So you talk about there being a lot of steps within this process of transition, and it sounds like you had a lot of good supports in the way along the way to make sure that you're kind of getting the best of all of the services that were offered to you as you were moving into post-secondary. But I was wondering if there were ever times that you felt like it was taking maybe longer than you'd like, where you felt that you could have transitioned quicker, or that or there were times where you felt pushed to start doing something that you maybe weren't ready for, just in thinking about the self-advocacy like you had talked about.
Yeah, I will say that in my experience, I will say I don't think anything was rushed or not rushed. You know, I always feel that being steady always gets you to the end. So that's just my personal view on things, that, you know, being steady. But in terms of making progress. Now, I will say that something that I have learned, and this was more a product of my own experience of not having anybody else, really, guiding me through this process, was the idea of self-disclosure, self-advocacy, to really, is a point, there's a crossroad in a person as a consumer, as an adult, that you kind of have to navigate, that no one really tells you about, is how much and when to disclose and self-advocate. And not that I ever had big issues with that, issues related to that, but it's just something that I know when I was younger, or, maybe age 21, 22, I may have self-disclosed a lot more than I do now in certain situations, which I just think is a product of learning and personal experience.
Thank you.
So, I mean, that part you can't really teach to a person. They just kind of have to kind of learn and figure it out on their own, if that makes sense. Because now when I think about it, you don't want to self-disclose too much in certain situations. And not that meaning you want to be guarded, the person wants to be guarded, but you just kind of have to kind of know when's enough, what is appropriate for that situation, I think is what I'm getting at.
No other comments in the chat.
Did someone else have a question? I thought I heard somebody.
Sorry, that might have been me. I was just letting you know there's no other comments in the chat right now.
Okay. Okay. So the next area of transition that I think, from my experience, I think was the big one, and I don't think it's one that's often discussed in IEP meetings or in education with students as graduating or exiting the secondary educational system. And I don't think it really talked about much in the VR as much as it should be, but which is the medical transition. So when we're thinking about, transitioning, as a person with a disability from pediatric care to adult medicine, I think it's starting to get more attention now, but I don't think it's one that's often talked about. So like my experience, I remember no one really talked about this. And this is probably one of the areas that I think I will say that my parents and I were kind of unexpected in some ways, from having to leave, doctors that I have worked with for so many years to now having to go somewhere else in adult medicine now, and having to transfer all the documentation that was accumulated with pediatric care that had to be moved over and transferred to adult medicine. And I think that was one that I wasn't as ready for.
Alert Cassie Rush has left the meeting.
Because, to some pediatric doctors that I worked with, it was a very hard transition point, once I turned 18 or once I turned 21, and it's usually the case for all individuals with disability, that they have to leave that doctor and find an adult, adult into the adult system and to medical care. So I think that was kind of a hard adjustment, and whoa, wait, we have to now find somebody else to build that relationship with, and that relationship with in terms of getting to know the person and medically getting to know the person. So like, for example, I had to leave my pediatric PCP at a very specific age. I had to leave my adult, not adult, my audiologist at Children's Hospital at a certain age. And so I think that was one of the biggest adjustments there, because the adult system for people with hearing loss is very different from the one in the pediatric system in Pennsylvania. So there's specific loopholes that work for the advantage of the family and the patient with a hearing loss to get more routine, care in that way, and to get more, and to get, updated hearing aid equipment, which is very important. In the adult world, that doesn't work out as much. That loophole is not there for adults, unfortunately, which is a big, I think was a big barrier in my experience, because I really rely on my hearing aids. If I were to remove them, and not wear them, or something were to happen to them where they, stop working, even one, if one stopped working, you can see where my hearing impairment will then, be a significant barrier in that way. So that was a, big adjustment there. And so, yeah. I would say the only exception in my experience in that transition point in medicine was my ophthalmologist was the only doctor that I was still seeing under pediatric supervision care, because he saw me very young in my diagnosis. So I think he wanted to just continue seeing me until his retirement, which he had retired. But now I have been hooked into a retinal specialist now that I see on a regular, on a biannual basis for care in that regard. So for me, and another big adjustment here was that, when I was seeing this new retinal specialist, new eye doctor, this is where I was able to get into genetic testing, to look at my diagnosis more, which at the time we thought was Usher. So we just thought that the testing results, would confirm that diagnosis that I received at such a young age. But the results came back very differently with Zellweger, which is a very different disorder that causes combined hearing and vision loss, as well as some other more significant disabilities as well. But I have a more mild form of it, where it just impacts my eyes and ears. So that was very shocking to have to relearn everything, and in a sense, it really kind of changed how I saw certain things medically, in that way, and not in a bad way, but it just in terms of just being more aware of certain things and things like that. And I think when I look back on my experience in a young age, and my parents do as well, is that the doctors at the time who made the diagnosis for under Usher's made that diagnosis with the information that they had at the time. And genetic testing was very limited in terms of what that could yield back then in the late 90s. And the other big thing that really I think about and I reflect on thinking about my medical diagnosis is that because I had the RP and the hearing loss that was so, that was under the Zellweger, is very similar to Usher's. So that's really, I think, really the big issue. When they saw those two issues, I think they automatically just thought Usher's was the appropriate diagnosis at the time. And I think it still is. And it got me through so many important years, having that diagnosis. But now, since we have a newer diagnosis or a more appropriate diagnosis with more accurate genetic testing, we just updated the documentation to reflect that, moving forward in the adult system. So I think that's important. Because I go back to the issue of documentation is important as an adult with a disability, with any disability, but specifically, my circumstance of being a person with deaf blindness, like I said, adult services and programs are usually based on eligibility. So if you have that up-to-date documentation, you'll find that, services will come quicker if you have that appropriate documentation. And I think that's an important thing that I think we can think about when we think about transition from high school to college, especially the TBIs in the room. When they're working with the student and the family, they can help the family kind of realize that piece. That documentation is going to be very important when they graduate high school, when they go to college, or when they apply for VR services, that having that documentation is going to be very important. And then so finishing up, my experience working with adult medicine has been very good, because I think once I got set up with all the appropriate doctors that I need to see, I'm able to, again, have a conversation with the doctor and be able to advocate for my needs and goals, and be able to work with the doctor and see what they, from their perspective, their medical knowledge, what would be, what is needed to know. And I think where I still need some assistance, in this transition, is having a third person, whether that be my parent or sibling, in the room sometimes when we're reviewing test results, just so that there's a third pair of eyes and ears that can listen in and provide support, and as well as they help provide transportation to, doctor appointments and such. So that concludes that little segment. And I have one more segment, a brief segment, but are there any questions related to medical transition?
Nothing is in the chat right now.
Okay. Okay. Now the last, and we can always touch upon more questions at the end. The last portion of my talk is about, where I'm headed now. Like I said, I'm almost done with school with my grad program. So part of my counseling program, we have to do internships, which is probably common for most programs. But so I am in a paid internship in my program. So I had to go through that, and that it had been a very good experience, and had really, I think, is the last stepping point that leads to gainful competitive employment for me in the VR world. And that's where I really want to stay, in the state system. So I had to go through, the online application process, just like any other applicant that wanted this internship experience. And so I think all of these things that I've been telling you about, my experience, like knowing how to use technology, knowing how to be a self-advocate, knowing how to have documentation ready and prepared, knowing how to ask for help when I need it, so all of these things I think have came to this point, but now I think it's serving me well at this last point. So then I had to go through the interviewing process for this internship. So I had to, be prepared, know what I wanted to talk about or what I wanted to share, be concise, and be able to ask questions to the interviewer to gain a better perspective of the different offices that I was applying for. That I applied to different positions, and so knowing, like, I asked questions about what did the office environment look like, what did the physical location of the office, like where it was in the state, like was it near public transportation, was it thinking about that, was it near a bus stop, a bus line. So if I had to relocate, knowing that it was near a bus line, knowing that that told me that, okay, I can get to that office or that position, if I was given the job. And in this process, knowing how to, again, self-disclose my disability and advocate for job accommodation, which is another important aspect that I think TBIs and VR counselors can work together. Because again, when the student exits and graduates the secondary educational system and they're looking for employment, competitive employment, they have to know what is their rights, what are their rights. And then when we think about employment and job accommodation, that comes under the Americans with Disabilities Act, Section 1, which is employment. And that's where all the things are laid out for, what are the person's rights, what are the employer's responsibilities, and really having a good knowledge of that for the student and consumer is important as they make that next transition into competitive, gainful employment. So for me, when I knew what the responsibilities were of the job, I knew what I needed to help mediate the barriers that I would encounter. So a screen reader like Fusion, a larger monitor at my workstation, a microphone that would connect to my hearing aid so I could hear, a conversation better, an Acrobat, which is a CCTV at my workstation. So if I have to look at printed material, I would have a way to magnify that. And then lastly, I needed an accessible phone, a work phone of some type that would have some type of captioning. So when I would make phone calls, I could, understand what was happening, and follow along if on the phone with captions, were some of the initial job accommodations that I requested for and received. And so when we think about this, when we think about, job accommodation, they should change if necessary, like if the work environment change, if the personal needs change. So having that open dialogue with the employer about what's working and what's not working is important to be able to keep and remain working. So, and that's a little bit, like right now, I know it's kind of not as long of a section because I just, am starting out in my career. So,
Thank you so much for sharing all of that. I check the chat. Still, I don't have any comments in the chat, but it's now a good time for some final questions if anybody has any.
yeah. So since there's no questions, I just wanted to make my final comment that I think really having, a good relationship with the student from both the TBI and counselor, but also having a good relationship between the TBI, counselor, and parent. I think relationships are very important to have, and what that might mean, and that could really impact how services are delivered.
That's a great final note, and that is a goal of Project Crest to cross-train professionals so that there is, more of that inner disciplinary competence in serving this population.
That relationship, because I mean, when I think about my counseling perspective and my counseling theory, I really pull from that, person-centered approach and a more humanistic approach when we think about the relationship between the counselor and the consumer or the student. And that, to me, can ripple out to other professionals as well.
And Hunter, I do think we have one final comment here.
Yes, hi. Hunter, this is Debbie Holzappel again. I just wanted to say, I've known you since you've been a little guy. And I've worked with your mom, and the message that you shared was very significant. So I want to thank you for that. And I just wish you well. And I want you to say hi to your mom. So anyway, it's just good. Just keep up the good work. And it was very nice to be part of this. Thank you.
Thank you. We have another message that just says thanks for sharing your story and your perspectives, Hunter. So
thank you for having me.
Yeah. Great. Well, thank you so much. This wraps up our CREST webinar. Thank you again, Hunter.